Podcast Network's family of shows. Available everywhere.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. We are in the home stretch of today's show, and we are switching to the front sevens after we've talked a lot about some corners and safeties in this league who are really eye-popping. And this guy doesn't necessarily stand out amongst premier defensive ends, mainly due to the fact that his defense is a highly collective unit, but I still appreciate this guy nevertheless due to his immense talent and his immense athleticism at the defensive end position. We are going to discuss the fantasy player profile, Mr. Trey Hendrickson out of the Cincinnati Bengals. When I think about the Bengals defense, and I think about the Bengals defense, especially in Joe Burrow era, I think about how it transitioned to a defense that really was two in their heads a lot and really was more focused on themselves than anything else, turned into a collective. And maybe that's why Trey Hendrickson isn't getting as much attention as he ultimately deserves, because he's someone who plays on a defense that doesn't necessarily stress, individuality. And even though he accumulates so many different stats and he's always among the statistical leaders in the league, he's seen as someone more, second tier than other players around him. Like, take Max Crosby, for example. People like Max Crosby just because, A, he creates space for others, and B, he just wreaks havoc whenever he has the chance. And compared to Trey Hendrickson, Max Crosby gets a lot more attention for how he plays. But when I look at Trey Hendrickson, I think that because there's so many little details amongst the Bengals defense, his prowess falls by the wayside. When I'm going to talk about his stats, they're going to impress you. And so without further ado, let's jump right into them. Throughout his career, he's accumulated 518.4 fantasy points. His best season was last year, where he accumulated 135.7, 28 solo tackles, 18 sacks, 10 tackles for loss, 3 forced fumbles, and 3 passes defended. And there's a reason why those stats don't necessarily translate to people. It's because people might question, how can a player who's in such an unselfish defense possibly have these stats? And I'll tell you why. So the way this 4-3 system is set up is much like, say, how the Raiders might set up, or how other teams I discussed might set up. I say like the Chiefs or something of that nature. The reason the Bengals only have quote-unquote one high-profile guy along that front is because a lot of their players focus on one specific trait to get them going. And Trey Hendrickson as the right end is the guy who's tasked with overwhelming those other negative traits in his teammates to cover up those deficiencies. And so when I look at, say, a player like Sam Hubbard, who's on the other flank, Sam Hubbard is more of a physical kind of plugger of the line. He kind of plugs the run. He's kind of a more TFL-based guy. And then when we get to the second level, the linebackers, Logan Wilson and Jermaine Pratt. I think Logan Wilson's strength is his lateral movement. And I think Jermaine Pratt's is his pass defending ability. And so Trey Hendrickson, how he breaks that divide is just being himself. Because when you're a right end, like we said before, you need to be agile, you need to outflank your blocker, you need to attack the blind side, and you need to get to the quarterback. You need to pressure the quarterback no matter what. So all in one player, Trey Hendrickson combines to make something that opposing offenses kind of have to key on even more than, say, if you had 4 guys on that line who just cancel each other out. And so that's why I'm saying Trey Hendrickson should be more highly appreciated, especially in IDP league, because in latter rounds, you're not going to find so many high-value defensive ends. All the good ones are going to be gone. Guys like Crosby, guys like Jones, guys of that nature, guys like Karlaftis maybe even. And the reason why I'm saying Trey Hendrickson might not go high isn't just because of the Cincinnati Bengals as a defense. I think it's mainly about when you're looking for, in IDP drafts especially, a guy who is going to be your kind of second defensive end. You're kind of looking for a guy who's in a defense that might be a little bit more lackluster. And people do respect the Cincinnati Bengals. It's not that they don't respect the Cincinnati Bengals defense. They just respect it as a collective. And that's what makes it so special and so hard to kind of look at Trey Hendrickson through the lens of someone who's elite, even though he truly is. And when I think about other defenses who are high profile or low profile, the high profile defenses, let's start off with, they have 2 guys who are solid, and it's mainly their, say, interior that's a little bit weaker, because they know that their 2 guys can create space off the edge for other players to kind of attack as well. We talk about low-profile teams. I think people value them because, well, that one guy is going to get a lot of production. When you have a team that's so unusual like the Bengals, that mainly stresses all 3 levels kind of playing in a system, when you have an anomaly like Trey Hendrickson, you're thinking perhaps I should go for him, but since that defense is just so well structured, maybe there's some kind of divide that will make sure everyone on that defense gets production. It's kind of like a distribution of wealth conundrum, because you know Trey Hendrickson is solid. But do you think that other players in that system will get their production too? Like Sam Hubbard is not going to get as many sacks, but he's going to get a lot of tackles for loss. He's going to get a lot of forced fumbles. Logan Wilson is going to get a lot of tackles, solo and assisted. Jermaine Pratt's going to get a lot of picks. So when you judge that Bengals front 7, all these players are in your mind except for Trey Hendrickson, because, well, you don't necessarily have to worry about him. You're balancing him out against the players that he has alongside him. You don't necessarily have to do that for other defensive players. You can say, okay, I'm taking Max Crosby because, well, he's the best defensive end on the Raiders, and he's going to get a lot of sacks anyways. I'm taking a guy like Chris Jones because he can move, he's so versatile, he can kick inside, he can get tackles for loss, he can get sacks, he can do that. I'm picking a guy like Karlaftis because he's young, he's hungry, he's going to get into the backfield, he's going to force fumbles as well, he moves so well, and you're confident in how and why you pick them. With Trey Hendrickson, it's a little bit different. And so I think that Trey Hendrickson, the thing with him is he's going to have to keep producing, because as the years go on, there's going to be more and more defensive ends in IDP leagues, and they're going to be more highly coveted than ever. I think defensive ends are not necessarily the quarterbacks of IDP. They're kind of like the tight ends, where every single year they're going to continue improving and progressing. And so Trey Hendrickson getting left in the wayside is going to be something to really consider, because he doesn't deserve to be overlooked just because he plays in a system that is so within itself. And I'm here telling you that in an IDP league where it's highly specific on who and how you pick, defensive ends might tend to be undervalued because you want the premium guy. You always want to swing for the fence on the defensive end, because you know that you can potentially get steals at the corners and safety positions because they're a little bit deeper, and you'll be fine there. But in the defensive end department, all these defensive ends are going to go pretty early. You're going to want a guy who's going to be sitting in the middle rounds of the drafts, who doesn't necessarily have to be weighed as much as you think he does against others, and a guy who just produces no matter what people think of him and his defense. And so it would be a travesty and remiss to not acknowledge Trey Hendrickson as a pass rusher to be reckoned with, because when you're looking at premier defensive ends and you're looking at where they sit in terms of high profile and low profile defenses and their profiles in their defenses, it's tough to override your mind in terms of who you might covet. And Trey Hendrickson should ultimately be the guy who you say, I'm going to stick with you, because it'll pay off in the end. But that will just about do it for this segment. Coming up for our last segment, we talk about one of my favorite veterans of all time, one of the best linebackers of the past decade. Does he still have it in the tank, playing now for the Washington Commanders? You definitely don't want to miss this last segment of today's show.